Guys, it's time to talk about the future of CSGO esports. Did Valve just kill not only what BLASTProSeries and ESL are trying to do, but any possibility that we'll ever get anything like what League of Legends and Overwatch already have? And I gotta ask, is this actually a good thing? So, about 48 hours ago, Valve dropped a bombshell ruling on a number of issues that we've been talking about in CSGO lately. There were statements on media rights for major broadcasts, on shared ownership and conflicts of interest, and on exclusive, therefore franchised, competitive leagues. Literally the future of CSGO. It's frankly hard to over-exaggerate how big of a ruling this could be and what impact it could have on the future of CSGO. So let me just read you the key paragraph when it comes to the exclusivity and franchising leagues thing. Recently, there have been steps toward a broad form of exclusivity where teams who compete in a particular event are restricted from attending another operator's events. This form of team exclusivity is an experiment that could cause long-term damage. In addition to preventing other operators from competing, exclusivity prevents other events from keeping the CSGO ecosystem functioning if an individual event fails. At this time, we are not interested in providing licenses for events that restrict participating teams from attending other events. So this is big, like it's bigger than big. And there's a lot to talk about. In this video, we're gonna go over how we got here, why Valve decided to speak out about this issue at this particular time, and whether exclusivity and franchise leagues are actually a good or a bad thing. And hey, it's not just gonna be me talking in this one. We're also gonna hear from broadcast talent Anders Bloom and the CEO of Astralis Group. Okay, so why did Valve come out with this hardline statement now? What prompted the gaming world's most laissez-faire, hands-off publisher, the deadbeat dad of esports, to finally break the silence? After all, there's been rumors and whispers for years about a franchise league in CSGO, but until recently, that's all they've been, rumors and whispers. And when I say that, obviously I'm talking about the current era of esports, not CGS and stuff that happened 15 years ago. Anyway, over the last, let's say, 1.5 to 2 years, it's pretty clear that CSGO esports have been tilting inexorably towards a franchised, exclusive model to some degree. That is, a model where a set group of teams play in a structured league, where there's no or limited relegation and promotion, there's revenue sharing, and obviously there's exclusivity in that those teams can't go and play for another league at the same time. There's also obviously degrees of franchising between the black sort of Wild West ideas in CSGO to the white city-based locked-in Overwatch model. Anyways, back to how this all started. First, BLAST appears on the scene. They create not a league, but a tournament circuit where a set number of teams have to attend a set number of events during the year. There's also reportedly a revenue sharing system in place, and that in and of itself is kind of already halfway towards the kind of franchise leagues that we're talking about. Except it lacks one super important element, and that is explicit exclusivity. Also, it should be said that the sheer number of events that BLAST has been hosting does create a sort of pseudo-exclusive situation where teams like Astralis, for example, have to attend their events and thus have to skip out on others. Flash forward to earlier this month, ESL makes a big move. They announced the ESL Pro Tour. It's a system under which they take all of their existing tournaments plus DreamHacks and mush them together in a kind of coherent circuit where rankings and points matter and where they have 2 championships per year at Katowice and Cologne. Fine, that's great. But that's not the spicy part. Shortly after that announcement, esports journalist Jarek Lewis, aka DK, writing for Dexerto, reported that apparently the ESL Pro League, which is part of the Pro Tour, will have exclusivity provisions. According to DK, the stipulation for Pro League is as follows. Quote, beginning January 1st, 2020, all member teams of Pro League shall not play in other Counter-Strike leagues. This means non-Valve sponsored competitions where the first day of competition, excluding qualifiers, and the grand final day are more than 14 days apart, besides Pro League, end quote. This would mean, for example, teams playing in Pro League next year wouldn't be able to play in ECS. Then, just last week, BLAST fired back and they announced something called the BLAST Premier. The BLAST Premier is essentially a year-long league that's split into two halves, kind of like League of Legends, a spring and a fall. Both have their own little championships, and there's kind of a global final at the end of it all, where, by the way, you can win $1 million. So imagine a world, and in a few months you won't have to because it'll actually happen, where the Valve majors compete for prestige with 2 ESL championships and a BLAST global final, not to mention the Intel Extreme Masters Grand Slam. If you thought figuring out whose era it was or is now was difficult, just wait till next year. And that finally catches us up to today, where Valve dropped the hammer and in no uncertain terms said no to exclusivity. Now, the first question I have regarding this ruling is how exclusive is too exclusive for Valve? It seems pretty clear from the language of the blog post that what ESL are allegedly planning for their Pro League probably ain't gonna happen. So what about BLAST? Well, nothing in the BLAST Premier announcements that I saw at least mentioned exclusivity explicitly, but we know from this year's BLASTProSeries that almost certainly the teams that participate in the BLAST Premier will be predetermined at the beginning of the year. Now, before you start typing your comment, I know that the promo video for the Premier flashed the words qualify in multiple ways, but I'm certain that that refers to their global finals, not to being in the actual league. So even if, and this is an if, BLAST Premier does not explicitly disqualify its teams from participating in other events or tournaments, the intense schedule of the Premier might just do that on its own. Would that exclusivity by default, let's call it, meet the requirements for Valve to deny them a license to use CSGO? The language in the blog post is vague enough to suggest it's a possibility, and if you're BLAST right now, that's pretty fucking scary. Next year in CSGO is already shaping up to be an incredibly exciting one, with ESL and BLAST, maybe among others, competing for exclusivity and eyeballs. With this Valve ruling, I have no idea what next year is going to look like, because one thing is certain, both of these tournament organizers are more than likely going to have to modify their stated plans for their upcoming circuits. So now we've kind of talked about how we got here and the hows of the situation, so let's talk about the whys. Why is Valve so concerned that they had to come out and make this frankly uncharacteristically hardline statement to the public? Well, let's take a really quick, really bird's eye view at some of the pros and some of the cons of franchising in a CSGO ecosystem. Now, I actually tweeted about this exact same subject hours before Valve made their ruling, which is frankly fucking incredible timing, so thank you very much, Gaben, for that. My point here is that a lot of the responses I got on social media were extremely negative towards franchising. The sentiment was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But are you sure it's not broke? We've been in a space in CSGO for, frankly, a really long time now where there's just too many events. There's been too many online leagues and there's been too many LAN events. ESL's overhaul of Pro League with the LAN event replacing the online league did help a bit, but just look at what happened earlier this year when the likes of Astralis and Navi and Team Liquid decided that they had to start skipping events. It was a pretty bad scene for certain TOs. The reality is there has only been more CSGO to play every single year, every single month. That's why we had to have a player break. That's why certain teams are skipping events, and it's only going to continue on this trajectory. Now, I was just in Berlin for the major, mind you, and I was talking to the CEO of Astralis Group about this very subject. You'll remember that Astralis and BLAST are now separate. And here's what he had to say.
I think that we certainly need more structure in Counter-Strike. You ask any of these players, any of these pro players here, they travel way too much.
Yes.
They don't know where they're going next, well, next week they do, but a couple of months forward.
Sure.
Astralis has really had a luxury of being able to pick the tournaments that they wanted to go to and, not go to others. An upcoming team doesn't necessarily have that, or even if you're just hovering within the top 10.
So the desaturation of events, let's just call it, is one pro. Another is the stabilization of storylines. When you read the press releases for the ESL Pro Tour and for the BLAST Premier, storylines was a word that came up a lot. They want to create a great fan experience for people who are new to CSGO and people who've been watching since 1.6. They want it to be easy to follow, and they want to sell against it, let's be honest. There's nothing wrong with that. Are there no storylines in current CSGO? No, of course not. But it could be argued that a stabilized league creates longer-term stories that pay off bigger in the end. Yeah. Speaking of money, there's one deceptively important issue here that we should touch on when it comes to pros, and that is attracting sponsorship money. Now, does CSGO have a sponsorship problem as it stands? Well, from some perspectives, maybe, but we seem to be doing all right. But the advantage of a more structured league, in theory, is that people paying thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into individual teams can feel better about their investment knowing that the team that they just paid for travel, for jerseys, for advertisements for, won't get relegated in a month, or won't disappear and dissolve because two guys on the roster hate each other. The added stability brings in added money. And again, this is something that the CEO of Astralis Group, Nikolai Nyholm, told me in Berlin.
If you take something like Origin, sure, we'd been operating Astralis before. We knew what we were doing. We knew our sponsor base and so forth, but we were out there because the sponsors had a certainty of of Origin participating in the LEC and participating not just this season, but next season and the many next seasons coming after that. So we already were able to sign sponsors before Origin had played a single game, right? Yeah. You know, contrast that with Counter-Strike. You're a new upcoming team where you're always dreaming of being up there.
Okay, now for the cons, the part I know you've all been waiting for. Number one, does it limit upward mobility of teams? We love our Cinderella stories in CSGO. Look at Avantgarde at this latest major. Talk about storylines, right? In a structured league where there's little or no relegation, we don't get that. Not only that, but you may risk including a frankly uncompetitive team in your league that makes things just less exciting. I'm kind of thinking of Cloud9 this year at the BLASTProSeries. Also, while I was in Berlin, I spoke to legendary broadcast talent Anders Bloom, and we talked about this exact subject. And for his part at least, he thinks that there is a potential solution out there. Maybe we reset the teams in the league at the start of every year. Maybe there's a different buy-in structure or a different qualification structure. Point is, he thinks it could be solved.
Well, maybe the solution is that if the rest of the scene continues as normal, then the franchise league actually doesn't have to worry about that and just says, you know what, it's fine. We'll just keep it. We'll invite the people that we think are the most qualified or have the best, you know, business connection. And I think that's going to be important for anyone. Like the kinds of organization that's going to be involved, probably I'm assuming will be someone who understands, you know, the whole business world at a higher level and can bring something to the table in that sense. And then the rest will have to qualify over time. Like every year, every other year, there'll be, you know, another buy-in or another whatever it may be. So I can imagine that there is a solution to that. But sure, it does fly a little bit in the face of the current culture of Counter-Strike.
The other problem that everybody's talking about is if we put all our eggs in one basket and then we drop the basket, we're kind of fucked. What I'm saying is if the whole CSGO esports ecosystem invests into one or two franchise leagues, whether it's ESL or BLAST or a Valve one, and that league for whatever reason fails, it will have already killed all the other competing TOs and we'll be left with nothing. The new Valve ruling clearly has this front of mind, saying, quote, "We support experiments that are scoped large enough to identify new and interesting opportunities, but not so large that if they fail, it would be hard for the ecosystem to recover," end quote. You probably won't be surprised to hear that Anders and myself also talked about this.
The scary thing always seems to be that, well, what happens if you make it 50% of the way there, and during those 50%, you've outcompeted everybody else to even make the franchising happen, and then it fails. and then you're back, you're nowhere.
Some of you esports historians out there might remember a little organization called CGS, which back in the early 2000s crashed and burned after sucking the lifeblood out of other TOs, leaving us in a terrible spot and setting back CS esports quite a number of years. And if you don't know about it, we have a video on it. Okay, so where do we stand? Obviously, this isn't a black and white issue. We don't explicitly know that exclusive franchising would be a terrible thing or would be the savior for CSGO esports. Not that we need a savior. But I can't help but feel a little, I don't know, disappointed that Valve has decided to come in and uncharacteristically make a hardline ruling that sort of kills some possibilities in the future. Yes, entering into a world where CSGO is pseudo-franchised and pseudo-exclusive at the very least is scary. The unknown is scary, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. I am excited to see where CS is gonna go just next year, let alone the next 5 or 10 years. But if Valve keeps coming in and cutting the knees out from certain propositions like this, I don't know, do we end up in a period of stagnation? Do we get left behind? It's kind of a question I'm not ready to answer, but maybe you guys can help me come to a conclusion. My screen is so fucking cracked. It is so hard to read. Wow. I dropped it in a bathroom in Berlin. Oh. And yeah, it's fucked. What's that? No, it was my hotel bathroom.
Oh, it wasn't like during the Astralis party?
No, it wasn't. It would have got destroyed if it had been. I'll always remember Berlin now, because I can't read my phone.